I know.
You know
Thank you very
the
much.
place so well.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to a special episode or 22nd episode of Cold War 2.0 with our dear friend, Tarik Cyril Amar. Tarik, how are you doing, my friend?
Fine, how are you, Kevork?
I'm good. Today is a special stream, my friends, those who are watching on YouTube, on Rumble, and Ganjin World, because on Friday I'm going to go on a vacation. Therefore, I'm not going to be able to do a live streaming. So I'm very much thankful that Tarik has dedicated this time for us today instead of Friday. But next Friday, while I am on vacation, we will continue doing this show, Cold War 2.0, on Friday at the same time. Today's episode is very, very interesting, especially after my coverage of the SCO meeting and the summit and the ramifications of such a summit and the agreements, or let's say bringing all these countries together, especially the countries that do not necessarily have good relationships, such as China and India, in a similar forum. And our friend Tarik is going to argue a lot today in favor of such a meetings. And I would like to really point out that Tarik believes that the West is stuck in solipsism. This was a new word even for me, Tarik. I had to Google it. This is a really, as we say, cooked word that I had to dig in and see what it means. So the West is stuck in solipsism, while a Eurasia Global South bloc rises, driven by a tighter China-Russia axis and India shrugging US pressure and pipelines like Power of Siberia to reshaping energy. Those are actually bold arguments by our friend. We are going to stress test the evidence, timelines, and trade-offs. What signal, what's his spine, and what it means for the next decade. Tarik, you call the Eurasia Global South shift unstoppable. Beyond summit optics, what hard indicators prove, let's say, a structural turn the West can't shape or slow? What are these indications that the West cannot stop this integration among the global South countries that probably leading the world into a multipolar sphere?
Well, look, the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, right? Let me start with a tiny bit of contemporary history. It really grew out of post-Cold War, post-Soviet collapse efforts to come to peaceful arrangements concerning borders and other outstanding issues between China and what re-emerged as Russia in 1991, and also the states, as it were, in between the Central Asian states. Mm-hmm. And then it took on this very interesting life on its own, and it became this major organization, right? It has very pragmatic origins. That's what I'm saying here. It was really based, not like the European Union tries to pretend it is based on this huge ideological idea. Originally, the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, was really based on very pragmatic problem solving to maintain stability and peace in a very specific region. And then it vastly outgrew that original agenda. And this is, I think, its 20th summit. Look, if the shift in world order away from the West and toward, as I describe it, most of Eurasia plus the global South, these overlap, of course. If the West could stop it, the SCO should not be meeting for the 20th time, right? I mean, that's the first thing. People don't understand some changes because they don't pay attention to what was there before. There was nothing like the SCO 30 years ago. That's nothing in history. And it really emerged 25 years ago, 24 years ago, very, very modestly. And look where it's now.
Mm.
So if the West could stop this, I wonder how something like that could grow so big and so important.
Yeah.
And the second one, for people who don't want to have the long perspective, which isn't very long, look, if the West had the leverage to stop the trends that I'm describing, right, then why did Narendra Modi actually go to Tianjin? Why did he go to that city very close to Beijing, where this very important and very large-scale SCO meeting took place? One should add, this isn't an SCO meeting like others. This was a special SCO meeting, right? Not a routine one. Modi had just been massively, diplomatically and commercially attacked by the United States, essentially by Donald Trump and his team. And if the West had the leverage to stop these integration tendencies on the side of the others, Eurasia plus the global South, here's the test. Modi should have shied away from going to this meeting. Instead, he completely defies the United States. And in fact, if you follow the media, the Indian media as well, the Indians have rubbed it in. They have been very clear about the fact that not only did Modi go to meet Xi Jinping and Putin and some others, but these are the two key players he met on this occasion. No, he also refused to take calls from the White House during the same period, right? That's a message. There's Donald Trump. He's calling you desperately. He's just trying to really frighten you, to punish you, to harass you with 25% extra tariffs on top of the 25% you're looking at anyhow. And you meet with those other guys and you don't even pick up the phone when he's trying to call you?
Yeah.
Excuse me? Somebody wasn't impressed there, right? So why did Modi do this? Did he do it because he felt compelled? Did he do it because he really wanted to, set a symbol of defiance, a matter of national pride, which I wouldn't exclude at all? It doesn't matter. The fact is he did it. He did it and he got away with it and more. He got away with it very successfully. It was good for him.
Yes.
So, yeah, absolutely. We are seeing this shift. And the problem with the West is they are not even yet fully aware of how profound it is. And that's my main argument in this article that you're referring to, in this draft article that I haven't published yet, where I'm essentially saying, look at the West. It's not only that they still don't understand how big this is and that they can't simply stop it. They also think it's all about them.
Yes.
So you get these articles in The Economist, in the New York Times.
I saw that one.
Wall Street Journal. I've seen them everywhere. It's like a memo went around again. And they all say the same thing, which is, for instance, there are other examples too, but which is, for instance, Trump has ruined 25 years, or sometimes they say 20, of relationship with India. It's Trump who is to blame. He offended the Indians. He offended New Delhi. He offended Narendra Modi.
Yes.
And now the Indians are turning towards China and Russia. This is idiotic. Of course, Trump triggered something. He catalyzed. But that's all they could do. What was really happening is a long-term issue. And the Indian observers are very clear about this. They look at this. They're like, do these Americans actually know anything about us? We've had a long-standing policy of what they first called non-alignment, then multi-alignment, but it's basically the same thing. It's playing with everybody and not being too dependent on anybody. And it was never to be expected that we would react positively to being harassed and cajoled by an US administration like this. So there's nothing new. And to give you a very specific thing, as we all know, there are issues between India and China who have a border of 3,500 kilometers, I think. Sometimes I get the miles and the kilometers mixed up, but I think these are the kilometers. It's enormously long. And much of that border is in the Himalaya. And there have been terrible incidents over time. The last horrible one was in 2020. People died. They didn't use firearms, so that's the way in which they restrained themselves on both sides, but they managed to kill each other.
Yes.
And I remember very well a major American public intellectual, who I won't name here, who a few years after that was saying, you know, Xi Jinping and the Chinese have taken a baseball bat to the relationship with India, and it will never improve again. Never. That's wrong. That's because this American, who's usually very smart, was projecting American mentality on Indians and Chinese, who are much more rational and smarter. It is not only now that Trump has entered the scene and disturbed the Indians, that China and India have been repairing the issue of the border conflict, including this very brutal conflict in 2020, small but brutal and symbolically very important. They have been repairing this for years, actually, with real progress. It happened long before Trump did what he did just like a week ago. So again, it's another example of showing you that there are a lot of Westerners who don't understand anymore how many processes are actually ongoing in the rest of the world, which is much bigger than the West, and by now more important. And these processes lead to the emergence of, indeed, a new international order that's now inevitable. The only way for the West to stop this, there is a way, but it's suicidal, would be to trigger a global war. Well, if you trigger World War III, a lot of things get stopped, including the West itself and its global order, right? Let's be clear here, right? It's not that the West wins World War III. But yes, the West potentially could do something so crazy that the emergence of the new multipolar world order is stopped or delayed for a long time because the West has been so destructive. But unless they do something like this, they cannot stop it anymore. It's over. And they better adjust, and they can't adjust.
Tarik, I was intending on continuing and asking you questions about the article, the draft article that you are going to publish today. But since you mentioned about they may resort into the crazy option of triggering a war, I would like to show you and our audience, this is the timeline of Ursula von der Leyen nowadays on X. And I can assure you that it is 90% now about war. Times are changing. And so
leave it to the Germans, right?
we already have achieved so much together. We have laid the foundations of our common defense industry and tech leadership. I just want to show everyone what is happening. Our defense industry needs predictability and long-term contracts. Dear Nikusor Dan, thank you for welcoming me to the military port on the airbase in Constantia. Everything. We need to improve our defense posture. This is not normal. I have to reaffirm Europe's solidarity with Lithuania. Europe needs a strong Lithuania to protect our... It is all about war and war.
Yes. But these guys don't necessarily get what they want, Kevork. And here's the other thing. When I said they can stop it by war, I meant World War III. It takes a very large war to stop a tendency like that, right? So if there is another regional war or a continuation of regional war in Europe, for instance, as the Europeans apparently want there to be, that's not going to stop the emergence of this new international system. It might actually speed it up, right? So Ursula in the end might be an unwitting tool of the history of multipolarity, as Marx might have said. Or even if there is, in the next few years, a war over Taiwan, which is much more dangerous again, that could go two ways. It could become fairly limited in its region, in which case the US and Taiwan would probably lose, right? And that again would mean that the multipolar order would actually be accelerated, if at a terrible price, or it could escalate in a large global war, in which case, yes, everything goes. But again, let me underline, when I said war, I didn't mean that either the US or Europe still have the capacity to simply suppress this by any sort of war. That's no longer working either. What they still could do, and I meant this literally, is suicidal war. They could take down everything with them, right? That I hope won't happen, but it's a possibility. But it's the only possibility that the West could somehow, in a very strange way, stop the emergence of a new world order in which it is no longer going to be at the center. It's already happening.
Yes. Let's focus a little bit on what you call the rapprochement between India and China. Besides the border clashes which happened in the past, and still there are tensions on the borders, those are important things. Border sovereignty, territorial integrity, very, very important things. But the disputes between China and India are not exclusive to borders. For example, we have India's Quad role, curbs on Chinese tech, investment screening, and so many other limitations that both sides are imposing on each other. In a previous stream, you said trust doesn't come at the beginning. It comes at the end of a long process of talking and negotiations. And if it comes, that's a plus, but that's not a necessary, let's say, ground to stand on when diplomacy is being utilized in such cases. But in the East, at least, when I would like to speak about the East, it is very important in the mentality of people in the East to at least have a minimum trust. So in this case, do you think that Russia is playing a mediator role or a facilitator, or bringing just these two sides based on a realpolitik together because of the current circumstances when it comes to the US tariff war against India and the mutual interest between China, India, and Russia when it comes to the multipolar world?
I don't know that because, I don't have that sort of insider information on how exactly Russian diplomacy is operating. But my guess would be that Russia would do exactly that, right? Because it's in Russia's interest to create as little friction as possible between India and China and itself. It's in Russia's interest to consolidate as much strength, forces, power, economic weight as possible in this. It's not a camp, but it is a group. It's a group with an outline. It's recognizable. In this group that refuses to submit to what the West calls the rules-based international order, right? This is one key criterion here of who's in there and who wants to be in there. And, concerning India, you have to see, as something we haven't mentioned yet, right? And I should have mentioned it. India, of course, has issues with China and vice versa beyond the border. And one of the issues has always been that traditionally China has, at least latently, threatened India with cooperating with Pakistan. Right? And Pakistan and India have just fought a small war. It wasn't even that small, with 100 planes in the air, right? There were great fears of nuclear escalation for a few days. Both of them have nuclear weapons, of course. So that was an important thing. But what people don't see is that Trump has done something apart from the tariffs. Trump has been playing very intensely with Pakistan now for a while. Trump has been courting Pakistan. There are crypto and mining projects. He's always very interested in money, for which he thinks he needs the Pakistani authoritarian military elite. Trump has done something that the Indians really don't like, which is he has offered to mediate over Kashmir, the long-standing conflict between Pakistan and India. And the Indians really don't want anybody to mediate there, and certainly not the Americans. They see this as a real imposition and as a sort of cloaked way of taking Pakistan's side even more. So Pakistan, interesting enough, was also at the SCO meeting, right? So that's another thing to discuss. But what one has to understand when one thinks about the relationship India-China, you always have to think about the relationship India-USA at the same time. And when you look from New Delhi right now, you don't see much that the USA gives you. It's fooling around with Pakistan in a way that certainly the Chinese are not right now. And it's trying to ruin you. It's picking on you because, the reason why the Trumpists have put these extra 25% on tariffs for India is, of course, that India has imported Russian oil. But what nobody mentions is that this is totally legal. The Indians have been buying this oil on the spot market. There's nothing illegal. They have probably even kept within the stupid price cap schemes that the West wants there to be. And what they have refined out of the Russian crude, they have sold, among others, to the Europeans.
Yes,
So
they
why
did.
pick on India? Indians look at all of this and they're like, what's this supposed to be? Right? This is ridiculous. Even on its own terms, the way that Trump has tried to beat up on India is really ludicrous. And it's something that would only have worked with a country like Germany. This may sound ironic, but I'm not ironic. With Germany, it's been tested. You can do this, right? The US can do this. They can submit the Germans to the most degrading, insane treatment, and the Germans will sort of bow and smile and scrape.
Yes.
And so will be the German who has taken it on herself to be the leader of the EU, which she actually isn't. Ursula von der Leyen isn't the leader of the EU, as she pretends she is. She is the leader of the EU bureaucracy. She's the leader of a serving executive. She's basically a Stalin. She is a chief bureaucrat who's usurping supreme political power in the EU, and she happens to be German. And what the Americans see from people like Olaf Scholz, German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, German Chancellor, Ursula von der Leyen, ex-German defense minister, who is now pretending she runs the EU, is abysmal self-humiliation. No spine at all. So, again, from Washington's perspective, maybe the Trumpists for a moment were confused. They were like, we can do this to the Germans. Let's try it on the Indians. And that was a mistake. Because the Indians still value their sovereignty. They actually do. They understand the concept and they defend it. They've always defended it, which may have something to do with the fact that they had to liberate themselves from the damn British, frankly. And once you have that experience behind you, you don't want anybody else to treat you again like that, right?
Yeah.
So with the Indians, they couldn't do that. And they really, really harmed themselves. On this, everybody agrees. Where I have an issue is when people think that's the reason why there is this rapprochement between India and China. No. The Americans have accelerated it, which was a super stupid move on their part. Surprise, surprise, stupid Americans, frankly. But the rapprochement is part of a much deeper trend. States like India and China are learning, as have Russia and China. This is an older case, but it wasn't so dissimilar. They are learning we must not let the West divide us. If we stand together, then the West can no longer dominate us. If we allow the West to play games with us, and it's always the same game of divide and rule, then the West has a chance to dominate us. But they're all learning. The Russians and the Chinese weren't always friends, by no means. But boy, have they learned their lesson. There's no way you get a wedge between them anymore. And so all these people who look at India and China right now and say, those guys, they will never make up. Forget it, can't happen. Same people told you this literally about the Soviets then, no, not the Russians, but the Soviets and the Chinese. They can never make up. Forget it, that can't happen. Oh yeah, where are we now?
Yeah. I hope people who are watching from the Arabic countries, especially those who buy into these divisions that the imperialist powers draw into their own societies and divide them in order to conquest and conquer and control and dominate and then subjugate them and then occupy you and then humiliate you. I hope that this would be a useful lesson from the Indians. I
hope that for Europe. Let's be honest. Europe is one of the worst cases now.
I didn't want to mention Europe, Tarik, you know.
It's true, though.
So I have how to say in Arabic, they say mawane, something like, because I come from the region, so I can criticize the people of the region. And I have been really sad to see that the same strategy for 100 years now, they have implemented the same formula and the same recipe, and it worked. But when it comes to diplomacy, Tarik, one of our friends asked, will the West ever rediscover the art of diplomacy? So isn't look, when I'm following the talking heads who support Trump, they say that this tariff war is part of a diplomacy. It is part of a negotiation tactic implemented by Donald Trump. That maybe we don't like it, but this is what it is. US is the superpower.
Yes, but look, if we go back to the question, right, that we were asked, right, will the West ever rediscover the art of diplomacy? Then the West has at least two big blocks, at least, right? I'm oversimplifying, but there is the US, which is the leader, right? And there are the Europeans. And then you have things like Canada and Japan and so on. But let's talk about the US and the Europeans, right? So, funnily enough, there is one area in which, empirically speaking, the US has to some extent, and for now, I'm saying this very carefully, rediscovered some diplomacy. And that is the relationship with Russia.
Yes.
Right? And the Russians acknowledge it. They really do. And look, you may think the Russians are just saying nice things because they want to maintain a relationship with this US under Trump. That's not what the Russians do anymore. They are not that obliging, right? So I have heard the Russians say now for months, actually, and Putin has said it again at the SCO and in Beijing just now. He went out of his way to say, actually, we think that this American leadership is different. They're listening to us. We can engage in a real dialogue with them. I don't know if he used the word diplomacy, but if you read what he said, if you read what other Russians really have said now for months, right? Since at least the meeting in Saudi Arabia, that's a long time ago. If you read all of this, you see that the Russians are confirming that from their perspective, and who would know better, the Trump administration is re-engaging in what you would call diplomacy.
Yeah.
Whether it will work is a different issue. Whether it's honest is a different issue. It's never entirely honest. Okay, fine. But whether it's all part of one huge deception, as people like Brian Berlatic think, different issue. For now, what we see is, with respect to Russia, and that's the one place, there's no other, the United States has rediscovered diplomacy. Now, I would add another case, which I think is in between, which is actually China. Because you mentioned quite rightly that, you know, a Trumpist hardliner could say, even our very brutal hardball tariff tactics, really trade war tactics, economic warfare tactics, it's not war in the literal sense of the word, right? We are not sending the bombers or the aircraft carriers. It's not that sort of war. So it's sort of diplomacy. Okay, let's go with that for a second. If you look at the case of China, China did what the Europeans failed to do when they were massively attacked by the US by trade measures, by tariff measures. Forgotten already, right? But it happened like 6 weeks ago or 2 months ago. Massive American tariff attack on China. Ruinous, mutually ruinous, right? Who climbed down? Most of all the US. Most of all the US. Because the Chinese answered, resisted, didn't give in that sense, very much like the Indians now, on a different scale. And the US had to come to an arrangement, and they did. It may not last, but again, the outcome of this very brutal tariff attack was actually a diplomatic solution of sorts.
Yes.
I think one can see this. Now, the power that they do not, it's not a power, the powerless club that the US doesn't apply diplomacy to is, of course, Europe, the EU, right? And this mixture of EU and NATO in Europe. They don't. That's not diplomacy. What happened at Turnberry, right? That was a diktat. There's this wonderful German word, diktat, right?
I love
one
that
side
word.
comes, I know, one side comes and says, this is it. This is the deal. Bam. And the other side says, yes, master. Thank you very much. And that's exactly what happened at Turnberry between the US and the Europeans. Exactly. Except the Europeans added, yes, master, thank you very much. And maybe please pay you for your wonderful treatment.
And
so no, in the relationship, funnily enough, between the Europeans and the US, there isn't any real diplomacy. That's something else. That's some kinky, weird thing. It's not.
That's a really weird thing, especially when we saw this when Ursula was sitting next to Trump and talking about how of a beautiful package of agreement they have reached, and the people were like looking into the agreement. What did we benefit basically in Europe?
No, it was brilliant because it was a pure nothing.
Right.
Trump didn't even give them anything to save face. You know, usually when you offer a very bad deal, you hand them something symbolical, like a lolly or something, right?
Yeah, even on the surface, you know.
Pure nothing.
Humiliation.
Beautiful.
Tarik, where will you publish this article that you have finished the draft? On your Substack or on other platform?
This is now with RT. I think they will publish.
Guys, on the band.
I know.
I know. Be careful. Be careful for the SWAT not to hit your door. Tarik, in your article, you also argued that UN principles, in my opinion, you give the impression that UN principles or reforming this UN is a cornerstone for also the SCO, right? And if that is the case, if I am a Western mainstream journalist, I have to ask you the following question: how do you reconcile that framing with Russia's war in Ukraine, or Russia's war against Ukraine, and China's sovereignty posture in the South China Sea and Taiwan? If UN matters, if the UN reform also matters, that we have to have this umbrella of rules and norms and regulations, then we have to also speak about the Russian invasion against Ukraine and the Chinese eyeing on Taiwan, right?
But here's the thing, right? I didn't actually say reform for a reason, because what the Chinese and the Russians are expressing regularly is not we want a reform. It's actually much more conservative. They're saying we want the UN to actually be important and act according to its own rules. It's not a reform, it's a return, right? To some sort of mythic, nostalgic UN that you may very well argue never existed, right? There's the catch here, right? But what they're saying is essentially we want to return to using the UN as the gold standard of international law and international regulation. That's their argument. Now, let me say two things. First of all, in this article, I didn't discuss this because short article, I'm not naive. I don't think that a world where multipolarity has replaced the West entirely as a dominant factor will be run by the letter of international law and by the letter of UN regulations. That will never happen. It will still be a world of fierce great power competition, right? So I understand that when Russia or China appeal to this UN gold standard, there's rhetoric here. Obviously, there's rhetoric, right? But here's my question then. What do we prefer? Do we prefer powers that appeal to the UN and actual international law? Or do we prefer powers that say, we actually have this other thing called rules-based international order, which nobody can define. Yeah. Nobody. International law is complicated. There's precedent. There's all sorts of arguments. It's not just one simple set of rules. We all know this. But at least it's not as arbitrary and corrupt as this concept of the rules-based international order, which is the opposite of international law. A lot of people don't understand this. They think they're exchangeable. They're not. When you don't want to have to comply with international law, that's when you invent for yourself a so-called rules-based international order. That's how this has worked. And that is what the West has done. And between these two, which are what we actually see in the world around us right now, I prefer the guys who at least talk about international law, right? Will they completely adhere? Nobody ever will. Nobody. And that's not a trivial fact. I take this very seriously. I agree with you. Now, concerning South China Sea, that's literally super complicated. And I know that there have been certain maritime law applications that went against China, but China also actually has a fairly good case. And when you see how the freedom of navigation is abused by other powers, in this geopolitical power game, going through the Taiwan Strait with your aircraft carriers and all this bullshit, then you can't pretend that China is like the rule breaker that sort of upsets everybody here. This is a very messy situation. Taiwan is not messy because you know what? Under international law, Taiwan is Chinese. Literally. It's literally Chinese. Even the US officially acknowledge that Taiwan is a Chinese province. Even they acknowledge that. A lot of people in the West don't know this anymore. But Taiwan is not recognized as an independent country. It's not. This is not the legal situation. Taiwan is Chinese. The problem is that it de facto has a high degree of independence. It de facto has its own government. It de facto steers its own course, aligned actually with opponents of China to an extent. And a number of powers in the world would not like to see this problem resolved by war. From a purely legal point of view, which is not my point of view, let me stress that, but from a purely legal point of view, China has a right to invade Taiwan. This is not a joke. They actually have the right to do this. No, it's a province in revolt. I'm sorry, that's international law. That's not Chinese politics, that's international law.
But it's quite obvious they don't want to do that way.
No, exactly. They don't. And that's very good. And the Chinese are right not to do that. They may one day change their mind. That I don't know. They know that they're preparing their military for that possibility if they feel they have to. But they haven't done it and they don't want to do it. And that's a very good thing. And I agree with the people who say there doesn't have to be a war here. Everybody needs to be patient. But the problem is that a lot of people in the West aren't patient any longer, and they're pushing this issue, maybe even to provoke a war. Maybe they still have the illusion that such a war could somehow weaken China. Maybe they think if there's a war over Taiwan, we can do with China what we failed to do with Russia, namely have this sort of war on the margins that demotes them as a power, right? That sort of handicaps them for the future. This failed with Russia. I don't know how these people cannot learn from what happened in and over Ukraine if they still think such things.
That's
about
why they
Iran.
want this to work with Russia so they can copy it with China.
Yeah,
this
and
is
it
the
won't.
approach of,
Sooner or later they will have to actually finally get it through the thick skulls that it's already failed. It's already over. So, but getting back, only one last thing to your initial question, which is what about any policies where powers like China, Russia, or India, or other parts of this whole complex of SOC BRICS, where they can be accused of breaking international law or not acting according to international law, call it what you want. You're right. That's problematic. But I would say one thing. We are now in a situation where the West has ruined international law. We have to be clear about it. The West has ruined international law since the end of the Cold War, at the least, probably before that. We have a genocide right now going on, committed by Israel and its Western supporters de facto together. There literally is nothing imaginable that is a worse breaking also, among all sorts of other things, of international law. That's where we are. We are in a world where the West has wrecked international law. So what I don't accept from people is that they turn to me and go, oh, but Russia. I'm like, yeah, what are you talking about? The standards that you want to apply to Russia have been broken. They have been totally ruined, and by your side, by the West. So there's nothing to apply to now, I'm afraid. Now, if we ever get to a future in which international law is taken at least a little bit more seriously, then I would love if everybody would be held to higher international law standards together again. But before this happens to the West, before this happens to Israel, I'm not going to go after Russia, Brazil, India, China, whatever. Doesn't interest me, because that is degrading international law to a simple, stupid tool of Western domination. Again, I'm not going along.
True. I just want to answer our friend Johan, who asks, can you talk about Pakistan and Armenia establishing diplomatic relations at the SCO? So a few years ago, I also learned that Pakistan has not recognized Armenia as an independent nation. And this has started to change nowadays, especially after the, how to say, is it a reconciliation? Is it a peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan? Trump brokered this deal between them. So after that, this has come apparently in the same package of the reintegration of Armenia into different camps in this case. But I hope that Armenia would not become a source of polarization in the region. I really hope that. But the Pashinyan supporters say, no, now Armenia is internationally relevant all of a sudden, and every big power is struggling to gain the respect of Armenia. I beg to disagree with them, but it is what it is. So my friend, Indonesia, I have no clue. I don't know what I'm going to speak about Indonesia in this case, but we have fresh news today, and this is about the power of Siberia. This is a power of Siberia 2, you're right. And this is a people are asking, is this a game changer or a counting fix? This is 50 billion cubic meter per year. Yes. So does it truly rewire global gas? This is 50 billion cubic meter per year. So does
for 30 years.
For 30 years, wow. Yeah. So how do we see this project in the context of Europe losing its pipeline flows and relying on the liquefied natural gas?
Yeah. So it's a game changer. Yes, I'm going out on a limb here. I'm not going to be cautious and tricky. It's a game changer, and here's why, in my view. There is already Power of Siberia 1, which also establishes a pipeline between Russia and China. I think 19 million cubic meters per year. So it's a slightly different order of magnitude, still significant, and coming from different regions in Russia, right? Power of Siberia 2 is a much bigger project. I was reading today about it in various outlets. I can't remember. It was either Financial Times or Bloomberg. And they were explaining that if this is built, it is historically the largest single project in at least the gas energy industry ever, right? Just for scale. This is humongous. It's been discussed for a long time, for almost 20 years, between China and Russia. And until now, the Chinese side has never committed. So what China was essentially doing was saying, it's a good idea. We're not saying no, but we're not saying yes. Right? It was up there suspended. And the Russians have always been the one pushing for the realization, for actually doing it. Right? And now what we seem to see, there's a bit of fuzziness at the edges of the news we are getting, but it does seem to be the case that they have signed what's a legally binding memorandum. And in this legally binding memorandum, it seems to be about actually building it, not planning, not talking, and so actually building, right? If this all turns out to be true, I think it will. It means that from now to actually making it work, there's only a few years. I have seen people on X, I think, saying, well, yeah, it could take decades. No. It would take decades if you let Germans do this, or the British, or maybe the Americans. This is the Chinese. Have you seen them build stuff? It's not decades. And the Russians are very good about this stuff by now. So once this starts, this will be up and running in a few years. That's not a long time. Then it will, for several decades, what we are hearing now is 30 years, and that's not necessarily the end of it, but that's what they are talking about officially, will constitute this enormous 50 billion cubic meter flow of gas from Russian fields, other Russian fields that are not yet connected to China. And who knows? I don't know if some of it could go on to Asia, other parts of Asia. I sort of suspected. That's why I wrote it like that. But first of all, it goes to China. So you have to see that the fields that are now planned for this use to go to China, like the exploitation being shipped off to China through this enormous pipeline, they, just like 10 years ago or less, were supposed to export a lot of their production to the Europeans. That was the plan, to bring the stuff to Europe. And so Europe would have profited immensely, kept profiting as it has before, from relatively inexpensive Russian gas energy, in other words, for its industry, for its heating, for everything, especially its industry. Europe has essentially said, we don't want any of this. By 2027, we want to be entirely free of any imports of Russian energy. We will see how that will work. I doubt it will be that clean cut, but they're still working on it. And now the Russians can actually say, you know what? We've got somebody else. It's going somewhere else, literally. So you can see how this changes the situation. It's no longer, it's sitting there. And whenever you, dear little Europeans, stop being idiots and come back, we can sell it to you. No, it's being sold to someone else now who is a close, as I think, de facto ally of Russia, China. Now, let me have a footnote here before the pedantic people get white again, because whenever I call them allies, there's somebody screaming, they're not allies. It's a strategic partnership. They don't like the term. I don't care. They're de facto allies. For historians, this is an alliance. They can call it whatever they want, and I'm glad about it. I love it. I think there should be a Chinese-Russian alliance, right? I will call it what I think it is. It's actually an alliance. So this is actually confirming what the Europeans have done to themselves. And this means maybe there is a way back for them. I can't predict all of the future, but it's going to be harder and harder. They may be stuck in the idiotic choice of deindustrializing themselves and buying insanely expensive American energy forever.
My friend, in this case, there is something also important, and that is Mongolia. So it's going to play the transit route. So a lot of eyes will be opened on Mongolia, and I'm not sure what's the political system there. If the people know anything about Mongolia and how they need some democratic change in that country, let us know in the comments below, because I think that's the weak spot in this alliance.
But I totally see what you're meaning, right? So this would be the place where you would start a color revolution, right? But first of all, color revolutions haven't been so great recently, right? Georgia hasn't fallen. They tried again, and it didn't work, right? Let's not forget there are color revolutions that failed. Ukraine worked at the beginning. The coup happened in 2014, and then it turned into catastrophe for the West and Ukraine as well, right? And a Russian victory, actually. So the color revolution thing, they shouldn't be so confident anymore. And then, of course, we have hardcore sabotage, like blowing up pipelines. And what happened to Nord Stream was not the first case, right? The CIA was blowing up pipelines in the 1980s to damage the Soviets, literally. So yeah, they can try shit like that, and they might. But here's the thing. Mongolia, if you look at the map, it's going to be damn hard for either MI6 or CIA or maybe the Poles or whoever else feels called upon to mess with Mongolia and in Mongolia to do their tricks over there. It's just too far away, and it is sandwiched between China and Russia, and it has a strong, I don't want to be undiplomatic, but it has strong ties to both, very much. If you look at the history of how Mongolia emerges as an independent state, right, there is an enormous Soviet-Russian input there. And the relationship between Mongolia and Russia is very tight and special. So getting in there and doing the usual Western hanky-panky, this is not Georgia. And even there, it didn't work. This is going to be really hard.
And this is not Romania to cancel the elections.
Oh, yeah, Romania, right. or Moldova. Yeah, you can't send Miss, what's her name? Maya Sandu.
Yeah, and I think Ursula von der Leyen has got her way out of this as she landed in Romania, and now she's planning her next war drills and war rhetoric from Romania itself after the canceling these elections.
You know, you can take the German out of Germany, but it's hard to take the Germany out of the German, you know. It always comes back with a certain generation.
Wait for this. I have to play some music when you're talking about such things. It's very...
I'm
It's
German. I
very
can say it.
difficult. You are German.
Yeah.
Tarik, what about Ukraine? Ukraine today, Russia said or claimed that they don't mind Ukraine joining the EU, basically. A friend from the Duran, Christoforou, he says, Alex Christoforou says there are two ways of looking at this. Option one, Ukraine in the EU speeds up EU collapse, or option two, Ukraine in EU is no different than Ukraine in NATO. Will Ukraine join the EU, and wouldn't it be a burden on the EU who is already overburdened?
Yes. Look, I have to tell you one thing. I'm not aware exactly what Russia said. What did they actually say? Because I know that they made statements about they're open to a consensual regulation of the conflict. Did they really say we are open to them joining
I will just show you the post. This is coming from Kirill Dmitriev. He is CEO of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, special envoy of the President of Russia for Investment and Economic Cooperation. He says just in Russia is not against Ukraine's membership in EU, President Putin.
Well, if he said it, then that's a very important statement. Which I hadn't seen. So Dmitriev is a very interesting figure. He is how should I explain? He's the good cop, right? Dmitriev, and I think this is very genuine with him. I have great respect for him, actually. But Dmitriev is very much somebody who genuinely believes in cooperating with the West as much as possible without damaging Russian interests. He's not a traitor or, some weirdo. He's very much on Russia's side. But given being on Russia's side, he is very much in favor of working with the West, and especially in terms of the economy. He has also mentioned, that's the part I picked up today, he has mentioned that Russia is willing to cooperate not only with China, but also with the US in the Arctic, and they could maybe even do it together at the North Pole. So that doesn't surprise me. And of course, since he is referencing Putin, that's serious, right? So my response to that thing that I hadn't seen, but now that you show it to me, is it could mean a lot of things, to be very honest. First of all, there may be a calculation that Ukraine won't make it in. And that would not happen because of states like Slovakia and Hungary. Now, Slovakia and Hungary have been marginalized in the EU, but in fact, you do need the agreement of every single state to accept a new member. Right? The text isn't exactly the same as with the NATO treaty, but the principle is very similar. The EU is a club where everybody who's already in has to agree to take a new member inside, right?
Yes.
To accept a new member. So the Russians could be thinking, they might even know something that we don't know, that the Hungarians and the Slovaks will never say yes, whatever pressure is exerted. One possibility. The other possibility that I would seriously consider is that Russia could also believe that Ukraine is going to be a horrific burden to the EU, and that by accepting Ukraine, the EU would weaken itself even further, which I think would actually be the case, at least in the medium term. Third one could be that they haven't spoken their mind fully yet. They could be saying, and remember what happened in 2013. In 2013, when it was about, so to speak, the how shall I say, a first stage of that process, right? And when Ukraine, then under Yanukovych, and the EU were negotiating the association agreement, right? Remember, that triggered the 2013 crisis in November that then brings everything down in the end, right? When that happened, the Russian position for a long time before everything exploded was, you know what, we're actually not against that. That was the Russian position. A lot of people forget this now. They were saying Ukraine it's fine with us. It's fine. But we also want to have access economically to Ukraine. And the EU response to that was, we give a damn. If we do an association agreement, then much of the Ukrainian market will close for you. and you don't get any exceptions, you Russians. You're out then. That's what the EU was telling the Russians in 2013. And this is one reason why this became such a hot and dangerous issue. If the EU had said, you know what, this is special, we want to give them an association agreement, but we understand there's a very special relationship with Russia, we will actually create some sort of negotiated system with you where you also retain special access, everything could have been different, but they didn't do it. They did the opposite. They played hardball. That was one main ingredient. Now, why am I saying this now? Because I wonder what Russia will say next. Could they, for instance, be gearing up to telling us next week, yes, they can be in the EU, but we want full access to rerun at a higher level? I don't know. I don't know. So I find this extremely interesting. I'm sorry I hadn't seen it before. I take it very seriously. But there's one thing I wouldn't do. I would not jump to the conclusion that Moscow has simply given up or is throwing in the towel or doesn't care anymore, right? Whatever this is most likely a very complex move.
Yeah. Wow. I no longer have questions for our dear friend Tarik. Someone was complaining that I'm not answering his questions. Unfortunately, I couldn't see it because I was focusing on what Tarik says. Yeah, I was really. I really don't know which. Not you, but somebody maybe posed a question I couldn't see.
Oh, Indonesia maybe. Maybe
Indonesia is a separate case.
Yeah, it is. I see why that's a question. I find that very logical, the question, but I have to admit that I don't know enough about that case. And also, we would probably really need a separate show to talk about that.
Let's do some research about that for a later show. And what's going to happen, guys, with this show is that we usually do every Friday, right? Today we did it exceptionally. Today it's Tuesday, so the next show is going to be not this Friday, but the next Friday. I'm going to go on vacation this Friday. But next Friday, we will do definitely a live show, maybe some nature in my background somewhere. I don't know. Meanwhile, we do some political talk with our friend. Meanwhile, I'm camping somewhere. So that would be interesting in the farms as well. Tarik, my friend, thank you so much really and appreciate your time, your intellect, and your insights on these very important issues. The comments are hundreds of comments thanking you also for this great conversation with you. And I would like to thank every single one of you guys for tuning in, whether on YouTube, on Rumble, on Ganjin World. If you like this show, the simple thing to do is hit the like button, thumbs up before leaving, subscribe to this YouTube channel, and follow Tarik's Substack. It's also in the description below. And if you like to support the independent work I'm doing on this channel, you can become a patron, patreon.com/Syriana analysis. If you don't like to use Patreon, there are different other means in the description below. And I will see you tomorrow. Peace be upon you.
See you.
Salam.